been basically begging someone to ask all of these questions from a non-Roman perspective for about a year or two. I don't have the linguistic skills to do it. So if you want to do it, I'm happy to work with you.
We can talk about that.
Thanks, Merle. I'd like now to recognize Professor Catherine Lavender, who had a hand raised.
Sorry, my cat has just appeared. I was actually going to try to summarize, but the questions that I'm hearing, I was seeing in the chat, really people are asking about the impact of class and income level, I guess, on the ways in which people could receive treatment or survival rates. I mean, that's a larger question, but I think that was what they were asking about. My own question is a little weird, and it's this. When we look at Procopius and the use of the word trillion, that's a really complicated word, right? I mean, even now, there's no agreement on what trillion actually is. And in the ancient world, I imagine it might have been used in a more fluid kind of way. And this leads to a larger question about transforming qualitative data into quantitative data, which you're doing, which is fascinating, and that's really a key. And could you maybe speak a bit about that? How do you bridge that gap? Because he's not actually doing a survey. He's not providing you with the data in a way that you could easily count and what he means by a trillion.
So I'll do the trillion thing because you know it's my favorite thing in the world, Lee.
Excellent.
And then Lee can do the data side because that's his favorite. I don't know if my favorite thing in the world, but so the trillion thing is because Procopius writes what's the word, Lee? I'm now completely blanking.
Myriad.
What? Sorry.
Myriad.
Yeah, he writes a myriad of myriads died, which is 10,000 times 10,000 times 10,000, which is how you get to a trillion. My little factoid that I figured out that I was very excited to force into an article, although I don't think it belonged there necessarily, was that the 100 million that you see floating around that Lee threw out at the beginning comes because Edward Gibbon, who wrote the famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, lops off one of the myriads. And in the footnote, he says, I don't think a trillion is right, but 100 million seems right. And actually for the next century, everyone thought he was a raving lunatic and said, no, that's completely absurd too. I know why, we'll make a long story short, it gets picked up as correct, as something plausible actually by scientists, epidemiologists for the most part. And so you just see that number basically repeated thereon. So that's how you get to 100 million in all those graphics. It's just Edward Gibbon making something up. So you're completely right. But again, you can see that's my favorite factoid once I figured that out. And I'll pass it on. And to answer the first question that you talked about, the class thing, we don't really have examples of treatment. There's some new work done by John Mulhall out of Harvard that'll be out later this year on some medical texts that talk about it. And so that would be the way to do it. But again, I'll reference you to John's article, which will be out in about, oh, I don't know, 7-8 months. Hopefully.
Yeah, and as for the quantitative data, so our approach was not to use the qualitative data, so not to use the literary sources, not to take what they have to say at face value. There is one article in which I tried to do this with an epidemiologist. So we tried to model the Justinianic Plague using the numbers in Procopius to see if we get the results that Procopius tells us. We did not, but that was actually not part of this talk. So I talk more about that if you're interested, but that wasn't covered here. The quantitative evidence that we have covered in this talk are things that we just find, right? So papyri, inscriptions, we're just collecting everything we can find. So all the inscriptions, all the papyri, all the coins we could find, and trying to see if there are any trends within those. So these were not, and we're essentially using them not for the purpose for which they were used, but just trying to aggregate that and see whether there were any trends that we can identify. Now, personally, I think that if you look at each one of these, you can probably make arguments, maybe more or less strong arguments against the use of each of these. And I would be much more reluctant to build too much on any one of these quantitative analyses. But I think that the fact that they all agree with each other and they all agree with with our understanding of the literary evidence, the archaeological evidence that we didn't really cover here either, I think it does point to something, and that makes me at least more convinced that we got something right here.
I'll just add real quick that everything we tested was what people anecdotally said, this shows plague. And so we said, if we take all that, does it show anything? That was our only question. It wasn't that these are perfect data sets. It was, you say anecdotally, so let's see if there's something there rather than just a one-off.
Joe?
Yes, next in line we have Professor Mark Lewis.
Hello, thank you. I'm Mark Lewis. I'm from CUNY, Staten Island, and the Graduate Center. My field is German and Austrian history, really in the modern period. So I'd really like to ask you about your argument in the earlier part of the talk, not the cultural part, not the part about popular interest in pandemics. It seems like your central argument here is the old explanations of a massive bubonic plague are incorrect. And I think, as one of you just cited, that was really the only question in indicating whether there were problems in these other interpretations and sources. What I'm not clear about is, what do you think happened in Constantinople during this time? Because one of you stated that there was an increase in deaths, there was a special official appointed, bigger graves were dug, they attempted to dispose bodies at sea. So what exactly did happen?
Well, I think to reiterate the argument, I think that what we're saying is that the pandemic, in the sense of a massive pandemic that kills half the population of the Roman Empire, we're arguing against that. Broadly speaking, they did not have a uniform effect. Now, if you want to ask about Constantinople and specifically, the capital city of the empire specifically, the outbreak about which we actually know the most about, there, I personally do think there was a pretty bad outbreak. I do not think half the population of the city died. I do not think 5,000 people a day died, or 10,000 or 16,000, or pick your number that appears in the primary sources. But I do think it was a traumatic experience for the people who experienced that. I think they wrote about it. It seemed subjectively horrible for them. As for numbers, I don't know. I don't think anyone can know, other than saying that I don't believe the numbers provided by the literary sources who aren't really interested in providing precise numbers. And I can only say that it was a significant outbreak on one hand. On the other hand, as Merle said, the state was resilient. I mean, it bounced back pretty quickly in a matter of a couple of years, let's say, even in Constantinople itself. It might also be interesting to note in this context that we actually don't know of anyone who died in the first outbreak. So, right, we have like a large reference books of all the prosopographical data, all the individuals, all the biographies of people who died, all the biographies of people who lived in the 6th and 7th centuries. And we actually went over this, and none of those people, some of those people died of plague in later centuries. I think we got to like 5 in total out of a few thousand. But none of the people, we don't know of anyone who died in the first outbreak of plague, definitely not in Constantinople. So again, another argument against this massive outbreak. We know that Justinian was sick with plague. He had plague, but he recovered. So for what it's worth.
Okay. Merle? Any response of your own?
I always feel like we end up tag teaming a
Tag team, yeah.
no, I mean, I basically would agree with Lee, which is, I think there's a significant outbreak in the city. I think the state is fairly robust in responding to it. I think it's a terrible event in the memory of the people who lived through it. But I also think that we can't take that experience of Constantinople and put it everywhere else where we think or we know plague struck, right? Just as we can't take an experience of many of you in New York or Staten Island and put that somewhere else in the United States, because each one of those is different dependent upon various reasons, both human and environmental and ecological, et cetera.
Thanks.
I point out two more things on this context, two brief things. One is that unlike other disasters, we don't get any commemoration of plague. So for example, there's a volcanic eruption about 100 years earlier, and that is commemorated in the capital. Plague is not, it just disappears.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
And I think that's interesting. And another thing we don't see is any ceremonial response. So for example, when there's an earthquake in Constantinople about a decade and a half after plague, Justinian, who's still emperor at that point, acts ceremoniously, right? So he takes off his crown, he wears sacks, he publicly mourns with the population. We don't see that for plague. We don't, it just disappears. Even in Procopius, if you look at Procopius, he has 8 books. Everything about plague is concentrated in 2 chapters. It just appears, kills people in Constantinople really, and disappears. It doesn't come back in his narrative, which again, I'm not sure what to make of it other than say that yes, Constantinople was bad, but it also, its medium and long-term effects were probably not seen as very important.
Thanks. I see a question in the chat from Kelly Reiser. I'll read it. Did knowledge of the Antonine plague, that was in the 2nd century CE, have any bearing on the reaction of Byzantium, I guess in the 6th century, to the Justinianic plague? Is there any evidence of a collective memory?
So I would say that no, based on everything I've read, all the primary sources that I think we've read everything a couple of times at this point, and the secondary sources, I don't think there's any evidence that I know of that says that people remembered something from the Antonine plague. As far as I can tell, everyone was pretty shocked by what they were encountering. They weren't exactly sure what was going on. I'll remind everyone that the people in Constantinople who are hearing about plague for about a year or a year and a half before it shows up in Constantinople. So it starts off in Egypt, it affects Alexandria first. There's a smaller disaster in Alexandria, probably. I mean, we know very little about it, but that seems to be the case at least. And John of Ephesus tells us that they're kind of like following plague or hearing about plague, kind of moving towards them, but it's very slow. And when it does reach the capital, everyone's very surprised. They don't seem to know what to do with it.